Tyler is jumping on now. He can make it for the first hour.
Oh, awesome.
Great.
We're now live.
Thank you. All right, everybody, welcome to a work session of the Silverton Board of Trustees. It is August 1st, 2022, and the time is 5:05 p.m. I call this meeting to order. Roll call, please.
Not prepared.
That's. I think we can just note that all of the trustees are here, minus Tyler George, who we expect to join us, and Jeff Davis, who may or may not join us. And then also tonight we have joining us Lindsay from Historic Colorado, and we have Lucy Mulvihill from our planning department, and Administrator Koshberger, and Nate, who's running the meeting.
Great. Well, thank you all for agreeing to this work session. This was a rescheduled work session. Originally, we had it scheduled for the beginning of June, but actually this works out a lot better because we have Lindsay here with the State Historic Preservation Office to talk to us about certified local government status and kind of how we can get the status, how we can maintain it, and then what it does for us. So she has a slide presentation that she's going to give to you all. And then this opens up another conversation, which is why Lucy is here to talk about a historic review board and separating that out from the Planning Commission as they have requested, and kind of how that might work, just kind of discussing how that might work. And then Lucy gave you all a great memo in your packet, kind of laying out how this might work. And she's done a lot of work on this one. So Lindsay, we'll have you kind of take it away from here, and then go review Lucy's afterwards. Does that sound like a good plan to everyone?
Awesome.
Great.
Okay, great. I will share my screen. Is that working for everybody?
It is.
I guess I can see my own screen in Town Hall there. Great. Well, I'm Lindsay Flewelling from History Colorado. My job is a preservation planner and certified local government coordinator. So I wanted to talk about a brief overview of the CLG program, and then local preservation programs generally, and how your program could either be developed, as a local preservation program by itself, or as part of the CLG program ultimately. The Certified Local Government Program is a federal program for local historic preservation, which is run by the State Historic Preservation Office, which is at History Colorado in Colorado. So a local government's preservation program is certified by the National Park Service, which means that it fits with federal guidelines on local preservation programs. So that's where the name comes from. It's that the local government is certified by the National Park Service. This allows a local government to be eligible for grant funding from the federal and state governments. And it also means that your local landmarks and historic districts would be eligible for different incentives and benefits, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So in Colorado, we have 67 certified local governments, which you can see on the map. Most of them are towns or cities, but we do have 6 counties and then 2 city and counties. So there are lots of different arrangements, and you can see that they're from all over the state. So really your local preservation program can be shaped to however best works for you. And we certainly have many different arrangements for preservation programs across the state. So at a more basic level, what are you looking at when you're thinking about historic preservation? At its root, it's thinking about what's important about the past and present that you would like to preserve and utilize for the future. So this can include preserving buildings, structures, which would include things like bridges and water towers, sites, which would include things like archaeological sites, ranches, and mines, objects, which include statues and fountains, and districts, which are collections of all of those other types of resources. And then why would you want to preserve? So there are many different reasons depending on your local community, but some that we hear about the most are the pride that communities take in highlighting their history and preserving the physical reminders of the past. And that helps with downtown revitalization and heritage tourism. And preservation helps to provide space for developing small businesses and affordable housing because you can use existing building stock instead of building entirely new spaces. Rehabilitation and historic preservation also tend to create more jobs than new construction because it's focused on skilled labor rather than materials. So it's obviously not necessarily less expensive, but the expenses come more in jobs rather than materials in construction. It's important to know a little bit about the legal basis for preservation programs in the United States while you're shaping your own preservation program. So the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 created the structure of the preservation movement as we know it today. And the act created several programs that we still use today, like the National Register of Historic Places and different programs through the Secretary of for the Department of the Interior. And these are also, it also created formal processes by which state and local governments can work with the federal government to preserve historic properties. It set up a national policy so that everyone in the US is working under the same programs, standards, and ideas that can then be adapted to what's happening in our local communities. And it's also important to note that this act was put into place in 1966, and in the ensuing decades, there were preservation practices and legal cases that helped to provide a legal basis for preservation activities in local governments. So we have a lot of precedent for what's allowed in local governments and what's not as far as your preservation policies go. So one of the most important parts of the act was formalizing partnerships between local government, state, and the federal government. At the federal level, the National Park Service is tasked with managing preservation programs. And then at the state level, each state has a state historic preservation office that carries out responsibilities on behalf of the federal government. And in Colorado, it's History Colorado's Office of Archaeology and Historic Preservation. So we have a lot of different names, but the State Historic Preservation Office, the Office of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, and History Colorado are all essentially the same thing, just to be extra confusing with all of our different acronyms and things. The National Historic Preservation Act was amended in 1980 to add a local government partnership through what's known as the Certified Local Government Program. And then it's important to note that there are also nonprofits and private organizations at the federal, state, and local level that focus on historic preservation that might include like Colorado Preservation Inc. is our statewide nonprofit, and then of course local historical societies and historical groups as well. So there are a few different elements to consider with a local preservation program, but the most important or first step is the Historic Preservation Ordinance. This ordinance would create a Historic Preservation Commission and describe the makeup of the commission, outline its powers and responsibilities, and then establish basic processes for designation and design review. And throughout the state, there are different ways of structuring the Historic Preservation Commission. So we have a few CLGs that have their planning commission also be their Historic Preservation Commission. We have a couple that use their Main Street commission, as long as it's the town appointed Main Street, not a separate nonprofit. We have one that has their Urban Renewal Board that's also the Historic Preservation Commission. And then, most of them are separate commissions. So it can be structured however works best for your community, since in a lot of the smaller communities, it can be hard to get enough volunteers to cover all of the different commissions that are in that community. And overall, the ordinance can be shaped to fit your community. It's very individualized depending on what your own needs are, because the community's situation with their own historic properties and future development are going to be different. So you can have a regulatory program with mandatory design review over designated properties, or it can be more of an honorary program that allows property owners to have access to incentives without any heavy regulatory burden on them. So it depends on what will work best in your own community. And then as part of the ordinance, you would want to think about what you're aiming to accomplish for your community in the future. So that's where these other elements of your local preservation program come into play. So survey is, finding out what you have in your community and the history of different buildings and the changes that they've gone through over time. The preservation process usually begins with survey because it essentially lets you know what you have so you can determine your preservation priorities for the future. And under the CLG program, you can get funding for survey projects. And I would say in Silverton that, would include, historic downtown and residences, but it might also include surrounding areas like historic mining sites and things like that. Next is designation. So that's the process of nominating individual landmarks and historic districts to local, state, or national registers of historic properties, and is essentially a recognition of the historic property. Designation is based on the significance of the property. So was it important for its association with an event, trends through history, a person, its design and architecture, its archaeology, things like that. And then its integrity, which is the ability of the site or building to still convey what it's significant for. So if you have a historic residence that was built in the peak of mining, but somebody has put on like 3 different additions over time and you can't tell that it was built in 1900, then it probably wouldn't still have integrity. But if you could still kind of tell what its original shape was like and it still evokes that the significance, then it could be potentially landmarked. The next thing is design review, which occurs when a property owner wishes to make changes to their property, so altering, relocating, or demolishing the property. That's normally conducted by the Historic Preservation Commission and can be either mandatory or voluntary. Under the CLG program, it's required to actually have design review, but compliance with that review is either mandatory or voluntary. So in some cases, you have to follow your certificate of appropriateness that was issued by the Historic Preservation Commission in order to get a building permit. And then in other cases, it's more of a courtesy review to let the property owners know what the best practices are for rehabilitating their property or altering their property. But they don't necessarily have to follow that in order to get a building permit. It's more of a courtesy review. And that, again, just depends on what works best for your community. Another element is incentives programs. So there are incentives available at the federal and state levels for landmarked properties. That includes a federal tax credit for commercial properties, which is 20% of the qualified rehabilitation costs. That's just for properties that are on the national register. But the state tax credit is for both residential and commercial properties. And for rural areas, that's 35% of your qualified rehabilitation costs. And that is one of the benefits of the CLG program, that your local landmarks have access to these state residential and commercial tax credits. There's also a state revolving loan fund for preservation projects, and then grant funding available for designated properties through the State Historical Fund. But local preservation programs can also include their own incentives. Some of those would have to be appropriated through the town budget, such as local grant programs, but some of them are procedural, such as allowing for zoning and planning variances for historic properties, which you might already be doing, but just pointing them out as an incentive can help to start conversations with property owners. And then the last element that I have here is advocacy and public education. So it's just really important to foster community pride and a sense of ownership over your own history, kind of fostering a preservation ethic, forming relationships with property owners and local stakeholders, and then celebrating preservation wins in your community. So you can do all those things without becoming a certified local government, and you could still feel free to reach out to me or with any questions and things like that. But we have, I think, probably 60 or 70 communities and counties around the state that have historic preservation ordinances that aren't CLGs, and then we have the 67 that are. So it's a really great community to use as resources. You're connected with each other as well as with the State Historic Preservation Office, so that the main benefits of the CLG program are certified local government grants. Essentially, the federal government grants to History Colorado a pool of money that has to be used as subgrants for the certified local government program. We can't pass it on to any other program. It has to be spent on CLGs, and which is really great, I think. But those go for things like administrative efforts for your preservation program. So it covers surveys, creating design guidelines, creating preservation plans. It can go toward public outreach and education efforts and things like that. So anything that would be an administrative cost to keep your preservation program going into the future, you can get grants for through the CLG program. As I was saying, your local landmarks would also be eligible for state tax credits and state historical fund grants. The state historical fund grants you could apply for with your local landmarks anyway, but it's it helps to expedite it through the CLG program. Then you also have access to Compass, which is our statewide cultural resource database training. So we provide monthly webinars to the CLGs through History Colorado, and then we also have scholarships as part of our CLG grant program to be able to go to the Saving Places conference in Denver, or we just sent several people to the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions conference in Cincinnati this year. So different training opportunities that we can help provide support for. You also get technical preservation support through History Colorado. I help connect people to different resources to answer their technical questions. There's a formal role in the National Register review process for certified local governments, and then commenting on federal undertakings. So that's essentially when the federal government either funds a project or licenses a project. They are required to reach out to the local CLG to see if they feel like any historic resources will be impacted by those projects. And that's often things like transportation projects or cell towers are the big ones that we see. In counties, there's all sorts of different federal undertakings, but those are the main ones in towns. On the flip side, the responsibilities of the certified local government program. The first one is to enforce your own local preservation ordinance. So part of my job is to make sure people are following their own rules that they've set up. Establish and maintain a commission. So, no matter what you decide to do with your commission for the CLG program, it has to meet at least 4 times a year and have at least 5 members. Send meeting minutes to the State Historic Preservation Office. I read everybody's minutes and see, what the common issues are that are coming up, if there's any resources that we can help with. Provide for adequate public participation. So, following open meeting laws, things like that. And then also if you do any bigger preservation planning projects, like a preservation plan or survey plan or surveys, making sure you have a public outreach element in those. Maintaining a system of survey and inventory. So for a smaller town, we would expect surveys to be updated maybe once every 10 years, or if you're looking at things like surrounding mining districts and things like that, you could also survey those areas. But as I said, we provide grant funding to cover the costs of the survey and inventory requirements. One person from your Historic Preservation Commission needs to attend a SHPO approved training at least once per year. And then there's an annual report that all the CLGs fill out. So those are the responsibilities in the program. As far as steps to becoming a CLG, the first one is to have your preservation ordinance in place, and then have your commission in place and have them start meeting. So they would have, a record of meeting minutes and decision making. Then have a list of preservation goals. In the CLG application materials, it calls it your preservation plan, but often this is just like 5 or 6 different goals that you might have for your first few years of meeting within your preservation program. So it could be things like pursuing grant funding for a survey, doing different public outreach efforts, and and things like that, just all those different elements of your local preservation plan. So it doesn't have to be anything, formal, but having a set of goals in place is part of the application process. And then you would submit an application, and then there's a status request memo that goes along with it, and then adopting a resolution to become a CLG. And then your materials would be reviewed by the state and the National Park Service, and then the certification agreements signed by the local government, History Colorado, and the National Park Service. And the certification agreement, if you decided you didn't want to be a CLG in the future, you just essentially write a letter at any time asking to no longer be part of the program. But otherwise we would hope to continue to work with the local government, for the foreseeable future. And then just the last slide was the website and my information in case you have any questions. But thank you, and yeah, please let me know if you have any questions now.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. Gloria or Lucy, do you have any requests for or questions for the trustees to discuss that we should consider with Lindsay, or any direction for us?
I think one of the biggest things about this program, and I was just surprised that we weren't a certified local government yet, is that we have the ability to apply for these grants without having to provide a match. Is that correct, Lindsay?
That's right. I should have said that, but yeah, the CLG grants, the funding from the federal government is matched by the state historical fund. So there are no match grants for our CLGs.
And I did some digging. We had started this in the past, this program in the past to become a certified local government, and it was stalled out for several reasons. So I'm trying to kind of revamp that and get direction from the trustees if we would still like to pursue the certified local government. And then as well as kind of keeping that in mind as we separate out that historic review board from our planning commission.
Awesome, thank you. Trustees, any questions about the presentation? Or benefits of becoming CLG or other things like that?
I can start. Lindsay, thanks for that presentation. I feel like that was really helpful. It seems like, to Gloria's point, we're already doing a lot of this without reaping the benefit. I think a question I had for you, considering you're a preservation planner, and as we go forward to the next conversation about historic review board and how we go through and revamp our different processes, is how do we get support around balancing historic preservation and taking care of the amazing assets that we have, while also recognizing we have a housing crisis, we have very high costs to build, we have a lot of limitations for people to build. And so how do you balance those two things when you're looking at historic preservation in a district? And would you, when you talk about some of the training that CLGs could get, is there stuff related to that about how people wrestle with these issues? Because I think, so from my perspective, I love living in old homes. The current home I live in is 1965, and that feels new. All of my previous houses were like 150 years old or older. I love old structures. I love seeing them revamped and given new life. But I also see times where certain ordinances limit local people's opportunities to build or to renovate or to do the things that they need to do to stay in their homes or to build a home or to start a business. And so that really weighs a lot on my mind as we have this conversation and move into the next discussion, because I hear it a lot from our neighbors, and I've just seen it in other communities I've lived in. And so from your professional perspective and in the world of historic preservation and planning, is there support that we can get to work through the balance there?
Yeah, there definitely is. I mean, like I was saying with our CLGs being in such diverse communities with different needs, I think you'll find good examples of the type of ordinance language that you might be looking for to try to balance the regulatory aspects versus incentivizing use of buildings. And I think, if you're concerned about, housing and cost to build and other limitations, then you might want to look at more of an incentives-based program rather than a regulatory program, or trying to find a good balance between the two. But we could certainly get you some examples of what different communities are doing. And I think that just the CLGs themselves are really great resources. So if there's a community that you think is doing well, then we can connect you with them, or I can try to come up with some to connect you with to see how their programs are run.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've got a question. I've done a lot of work in historic preservation. I grew up helping my dad do it, and then I've worked for the San Juan County Historical Society on and off for the last 25 years, I guess now. And one of the things we're running into more and more is if we become the CLG, is there more paperwork or oversight in order to get some of these projects done? Because on one of the more recent projects that I worked on, it was just an older house at Idorado that just needed a roof, but due to where the funding was coming from and who was involved in it, it took almost 2 years to put a roof on a building that was going to fall over. So I'm just wondering if this makes it more difficult to actually get the work done, or if it's really just a partnership that can give us access to more funding.
Yeah, so I don't review individual projects that are being done by the CLGs. So there's no extra regulatory or review element unless you have like a specific question about something that's going on in that preservation project. But even then, I can't like have an opinion necessarily. I can only point you toward resources. The only thing that would be if somebody was trying to get tax credits, that has a review element to it, but I don't personally review any projects like that.
Sure. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, my question is an efficiency question for the town and how it relates to outside organizations. And just thinking about anytime the word grant writing comes up or surveys or things like that, I'm thinking a little bit about, I know, Gloria, you said that a lot of this is currently in place and something that the town is working on. And I wanted to get a sense of just how much of it is already managed and how much new work does this add, just because I think to head down a big pathway like this, it seems like something we'd want to know we can be successful with.
Wasn't sure if you're asking me or Gloria.
It's more for Gloria, but I wonder, I think it's more for Gloria, but the interaction between the two organizations.
I would say that, well, some CLGs have, a dedicated staff person, but most of the time it's a planner that also attends the HPC meetings. And then for the CLG program, the annual report is important to have filled out. Is hopefully not too arduous. And then obviously grant writing is something that a staff person or an HPC member would have to undertake. But we do have CLGs that don't have any staffing at all, which I wouldn't recommend, but it is possible to do it with sort of minimal staff time.
Oh, shoot. Am I unmuted?
Yeah, Gloria, how does that sound to you in terms of staff time and dedication?
Sure, and this is one reason why I picked this one up, is that since we did now that we do contract with our planners, I see this as project that, you know, something that Lucy could take on as she goes to full time, and more of these like long-term projects that we would need to get it done in the community rather than just reviewing the applications. So utilizing the CPS for those application reviews, and then utilizing Lucy for kind of these more long-term projects that are going on. So I mean, when I look at this, I think, why haven't we done this yet? And so that's, I guess I do that with a lot of stuff. I'm like, well, we need to do this right now. So it's really if this fits with your priorities, which it doesn't really fit with a specific priority. That's really why I wanted to bring it up too. But I do see it as something, and specifically for the library. So thinking about just that specific building and being able to get grant funding without having to do a match for it and for the renovation of the library. That's really where all of this came from. It also came from Lisa Adair's to-do list about 3 years ago when she was hired, was to become a certified local government. And that was something that kind of flagged me. It's like, well, this is something that was a priority, so I'm wondering if it still is. So I guess I'm asking direction from you all if we wanted to pursue this, given that I think we can accomplish it through this new historic review board, and then with the capacity of Lucy.
Okay, thanks.
I mean, it sounds like we're already planning to, it sounds like the requirements to become a CLG are things that we already have in the works to do. You know, we're separating out the committee, and we're creating standards, and it doesn't sound like there's really anything besides that administration that is cumbersome. And if we're going to do the cumbersome part, either way, I'm not hearing a whole lot of reason. As like Tyler's question was a good one, and it doesn't sound like it creates more red tape than already exists. I'm guessing on that project, it had to do with the type of funding they were getting, which is going to exist either way.
Yeah, and if there's no added anything like that, that's huge for the contractors, because otherwise people just won't take the work and then these historic projects won't get done. But yeah.
And so I'm not really hearing any detriment other than kind of like the obligation of the committee members to participate in an annual, you know, educational conference, which is probably a good thing for the community anyway. So I don't know, from what I've heard so far, it sounds like this is just a good idea.
Yeah.
I think, again, I want to make sure from Gloria and from Lindsay, and if Lucy has any comments, like, does a process like this make it more expensive to build or cheaper to build? Does it make it more accessible to rehab or renovate or build, or less accessible? Does it make the process to do all of this more transparent or less transparent? Because I know sometimes we can have good intentions with some of these ordinances, but they don't always lead to the outcomes we want. And that's what I'm just super sensitive to. But I think it probably goes to the larger discussion of, what does our code look like? What does our historic review board look like? What exactly are we asking people to do as part of the process? And so it's less, I guess my concerns are less about the CLG and more about the back part of what we're.
I mean, this might be, I don't know if Jesse wants to weigh in, but so we have a community member here, Jesse Rowe, who's at the tail end of a process that went through the historic review committee as it stands today. Are the things that we're talking about relevant to that you think are?
I think the concerns you all raise are exactly what made me interested in this process, having gone through it. I want to see our community also be able to alleviate some of the housing burdens that we have. We have this really ironic situation where we have all these dilapidated buildings that are vacant sitting around, and then we also have an extreme need for workforce housing. It seems just inefficient that those two things can't come together, which is, I think, what you're getting at, Dana. And from that perspective, I do think our current code is onerous. I don't think that this particular process would do anything from what I've heard, again, as a an outsider who has no expertise, I don't think this would add anything that wouldn't be positive for us. I think some structure to the current process would be a welcome thing for citizens. Some cleanup of the code, somebody doing that work would be a welcome thing for citizens. Having even a thought process around what are we preserving versus what does new building look like? You know, everything that I've heard about this is great. And then the other aspect, you know, are the committee size that they talked about of 5. I think that would be much better than our current situation. I think there's 6 or 8 people and then a lot of staff members that have to attend that function as if they belong to the committee. And so it becomes a jumbled conversation that's very long and without much order. So I think my experience of the process is that additional structure and clarity would be really helpful for citizens, which is why I'm here to listen and make comment.
Gloria, thank you.
Yeah, and I also wanted to let you all know that, you know, it's not just town buildings that would be eligible for these fundings. So that if we in our survey identified other buildings in the community, and Lindsay, please correct me if I'm wrong on this one, but if we like, it's private buildings too, that are eligible for this funding as well. So it's a service to the community. Lindsay, did you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so the CLG grants specifically are for projects undertaken by the town, like surveys and your administrative projects like preservation planning and things like that. And then tax credits are for private or nonprofit owners, and state tax credits can be sold. So that's why nonprofits are able to get those as well. So that's a big incentive, especially for rural areas where it's 35% of your costs coming back to you in the form of tax credits, or you can sell them usually at like 90 cents to the dollar. So you'd be getting, you know, maybe 30% of your costs back. And then the state historical fund grants, those private property owners are eligible, but I think it's a 50% match for actual construction work. I would have to look at those match requirements specifically. So it depends on who the owner is for the match requirements on state historical fund grants, but they would be eligible.
Does becoming a CLG improve the chances of getting those grants awarded, or have any specific impact on that?
Well, for the state historical fund, you have to have, well, it depends on what type of landmark it is. So if you have National Historic or National Register of Landmarks, then they would be eligible anyway. And then local landmarks are also eligible. So for the CLG program specifically, that's where you're eligible for the tax credits, but the grants are just local landmarks generally.
Thank you. That sounds like we'd like to give direction to pursue becoming a CLG.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody agree?
I agree.
Jim?
Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Gloria, does that sound good?
That sounds great. Thank you. I was just trying to find the mute button. Thank you so much, Lindsay. I appreciate all your comments tonight and all your questions that you've answered for the last couple of weeks with me.
Oh, yeah, of course. And, you know, I'm here as a resource for you, you know, whether or not you become a CLG, but we have model ordinances and some other model documents if you, you know, have any questions about what a new ordinance might look like and how that could fit in with what you already have in your code.
Great. Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Lindsay.
Thank you.
We'll be in touch. And then Lucy can walk you through her memo on kind of how to separate out our historic. So basically, we have our historic review board that we created through these overlay districts, and now then the planning commission was acting as the historic review board. We are asking, or the planning commission has asked, because there have been so many applications that have been going through the historic review board process, that it's kind of bogging down what the planning commission is doing. And so they have requested that we explore separating those two out. Lucy, do you want to walk them through your memo real quick? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so as Gloria noted, the Planning Commission has requested to separate. And in this process, we can also kind of use this to amend our codes and add requirements to the Historic Review Board to comply with the Certified Local Government Historic Preservation Commission standards. So in this memo, I've kind of laid out what that would look like, and I've made a few recommendations. So right now, according to our codes, the Historic Review Committee requires, is a 5-member board with a member of the Board of Trustees, 2 owners of property within the Historic Overlay District, and 1 at-large year resident of the town. And then a member of the San Juan Historic Impact Assessment Review Committee. As far as I know, I'm not sure if this is still an acting committee, still meeting, if anyone knows.
I've never
I haven't
heard of
heard
this
of it.
committee, but I also don't have, a ton of tenure. So I don't know, Jim, have you heard of this committee?
Tyler?
Or Tyler?
I'm sorry, the Historic Impact Review.
The Historic Impact Assessment Review Committee,
Yeah,
San Juan County.
I've never heard of that. Do they refer to themselves as the San Juan County Historical?
It's in the code.
It's in the code? Yeah,
I was
Oh,
always
Lucy,
under
I
the
think you
impression that
froze. Sorry, what was that, Jim?
I was always under the impression that they called themselves something else, but served as that purpose.
Oh, so it has a different name, but it's functioning as that element of the code.
So I guess that's probably the subset of the Planning Commission that became the Planning Commission, and we just never called it by its formal name. And so I think that's the committee that we're actually being asked to separate out from the Planning Commission.
All right.
As opposed to it
Instead of the Historical
So-
Review Board, we're going to be the
Commission, the historic
Other-
commission,
copy.
or that's how I read it.
And I think we just lost Lucy. Yeah. Well, I guess we could discuss for a moment until she comes back. One thought to clarify that kind of nuance that the code refers to a committee that is what we're actually trying to reinstate as an independent thing separate from the Planning Commission is perhaps instead of a member of that committee or references to that committee, this new committee would have 1 member from the Planning Commission as opposed to kind of referring to the same thing that we're it's circular right now.
So 1 member of the Planning Commission, but the Historic Review Board would not necessarily have 1 member on the Planning Commission. They wouldn't, it would be the same person. The person that's the representative on the Planning Commission is also representative on the Planning Commission.
Right. Yeah. So
That's the
essentially,
way that Jim serves on the planning commission now as a member of the board.
Right.
so just make it super clear. There's in this memo, there's a recommendation of 5 members. The second one, I would just delete what's there and add member from the Planning Commission.
Am I allowed to say? Not yet. Okay, I just want to share from our experience that there's a lot of lack of communication between the historic committee and the building department, but they have to interface right now, 10 times in the process. And I don't know how onerous it would be to add these meetings to the building inspector's agenda. But a lot of things that the historic committee likes to do, again, this is my opinion, don't actually work with current building codes. So there's a lot of back and forth. I feel that having that person in the room to just weigh in and say, actually, commercial doors are 8 feet tall, or whatever the thing is, would be very helpful for efficiency. So that could be a replacement for that person.
That would
So-
be staff.
So I would note the issue spotting is spot on and super helpful. That normally how we've done this since Gloria's gotten here, which I think has worked really well, is that there's a staff member appointed, not in an official, like not as a voting member of the committee, but they essentially like run or organize, the meeting. So like each of our subcommittees has a staff member who kind of shows up and facilitates.
And they write the agenda.
Right. And so in this case, it sounds like either Gloria or someone from the, our building inspector, somebody else would be that facilitator of the meeting. So there'd be the 5 voting members that are all kind of like listed, and then you'd have a staff member that facilitates the meeting. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I just think that right now in practice, like Lucy has to go to the meeting. The building inspector doesn't go to the meeting, but probably should be at the meeting. When we were there, Gloria went to the meeting. So there's a lot of redundant staff time already. And I think the building inspector specifically not being required to go. I get what you're saying, that they wouldn't necessarily be a voting member. Also, just as a comment on the current composition, one thing that I've also heard from my neighbors is that because so many of the property owners in the historic district don't necessarily live year round, it would be great to see a stipulation put on the property ownership seats that they at least be Silverton residents. I don't think we have that problem right now, but it kind of makes sense that you would reside in Silverton if you sit on this committee.
Cool. Lucy, we lost you for a minute. I think you were kind of mid-presentation, so if we want to, and so we just discussed in your absence, but if you want to take back over.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. My Wi-Fi cut out on me. Yeah, so I was saying that 40% of the board be professionals in the disciplines laid out in the memo. And then that is a CLG requirement. And that local governments are required to adopt professional qualifications for each discipline. And then according to our codes, members shall be appointed by the Board of Trustees for a 2-year term. Additional historic review board action requirements will be required as outlaid in the certified local government requirements, which is kind of what Lindsay spoke on. So from there, I just recommend kind of adding all of the CLG requirements to our codes and amending that section. And then I missed if you guys deemed the San Juan County Historic Impact Assessment Review Committee as still existing or not. But if not, then adding a qualification in place of that. And then to kind of recruit members during this transition, I recommend adopting 2 or 3 qualifying members from the existing planning commission to the historic review board for a 1-year term, and recruit 2 to 3 new qualifying members for a 2-year term, so that turnover matches what the code requires. And there was one more. Yeah, and then to just kind of keep those qualifications on record and available and included in any recruitment that happens via newspaper, social media, or community outreach. And happy to answer any questions.
I'm wondering about the historic society that already exists in Silverton, and if there's how they're included or how they relate to this board.
So I had a thought that maybe directs the discussion on that or focuses the discussion on that. So I was looking at the member composition, and I kind of aggregating some of the things we've already said and then some notes I had beforehand. I thought it would make sense for there to be 1 member from the Board of Trustees, 1 member from the Planning Commission that isn't a trustee.
Yeah.
1 resident property owner from the Historic Overlay District, one member from the San Juan County Historical Society, and then one citizen at large. And I feel like that way we
Yeah.
incorporate all those groups. And then I got a little nervous with like 2 property owners and a citizen at large. It's like, I feel like more overlap with existing committees or groups helps provide more context and more uniformity.
Should we put somebody from the county on there or no? And I mean, there's one person that obviously already sits on a lot of those boards and they would cover all of those things, but I'm not sure. I know it's more of a town thing, but maybe having them included might.
Well, we still already have the planning commission that is a county and town board.
Mm-hmm.
And our historic overlay districts and our architectural overlay districts are limited in town. I'm just thinking about people's commitments and obligations, like,
Yeah.
will we add up to too many people that don't have enough qualifications that we can't see the board? Well, most people that work in the county live in town, so maybe there is a great person that overlaps with that.
It's also possible the planning commission person, has, I mean, I
That's
guess
kind
it's
of
just
how I
not
heard the
in there.
planning commission person as being someone who overlaps with the county meetings.
Like I think about like Jim Weller or who else is on the planning commission right now? Melissa Childs, like both, like one's in building, one's in real estate, so they both would technically qualify. But they're also both year-round residents. So it's like, I think people can check multiple boxes, but we have to figure out how to identify which individual checks which box for these 5 members. It's a little bit complicated, but.
And then after their term, so initially I hear how you've layered that, Lucy, so that there isn't, a complete turnover and they can comply with the regulations. So following that initial setup of all of the members, then do people have the option to run for additional terms, or after your 2-year term, are you just done? That's what you serve on that board.
No, according to
Sorry,
the code, you can go up again.
Okay, thanks.
And does that come
Looks
to
like I
the
mixed up.
town trustees? Okay, yeah. And is that
In the draft, yeah.
the draft? Yeah.
In the memo.
It says there isn't a term limitation, but each time their term is up, they would reapply and the trustees would decide.
Right.
Yes.
I like what you proposed, Shane. I'm a little stuck on only having one property owner, because I think those are the folks that have the most invested and this conversation affects them the most. And so I'm just a little, again, back to like benefiting locals, thinking about what is important in the area, in these areas. I'm just wondering if we only have one property owner in the district. Do we need to have a year-round resident, or could we have 2 property owners? Because the other people are still year-round residents, right? Like if we had a Jim Weller or Mel Childs or other people that are serving on the planning commission are year-round resident. And so I'm just wondering about only one property owner that lives in the district. I don't know. Thoughts, comments, Jim?
Thank you. I believe that they need to be year-round residents, true residents. But B, I would feel more confident in this discussion if we had a representative, if not 1 or 2, from the actual historical society. I think we're having a lot of discussion here, and we're not including the folks that should be included in this discussion. That's just my comment. That's my piece.
Thanks. I mean, I know that, so Bev had wanted to be here. She wasn't able to make this meeting. I think we can, give some feedback on this. And then I imagine like, we're not going to vote on this in a vacuum. This would come up in front of a trustee meeting where I would hope we would get additional feedback from those folks once they saw this version. Or I guess a good question would be like Lucy and Gloria, like has this been run past someone from the Historical Society and have we gotten any feedback?
It has not, no. I also reached out to Bev to talk about it, but we have not had an opportunity to talk yet.
Good, Jim?
Yeah, I think we should try reaching out to someone else. Other than Bev Rich right now.
Yeah.
She's currently convalescing, and I think we should reach out to another member of the board.
Okay.
Cool.
Mhm.
So I guess regardless of whatever feedback we provide, one of the pieces of feedback or the direction that the board's giving is that we ask the Historical Society to weigh in on the next iteration of this draft.
Right.
Okay.
My only thought, and we don't need to decide this tonight because this isn't what this, because it's a work session. My only thought on I think the two property owners is good because there's so much working knowledge and that would, I think, expedite a process towards improving our systems and what we have in place. I think and it's really more of a question than anything, is just what is the population density of the areas in our community that have this, that are most interacting with the codes? Because right now, I think, sort of what Jesse brought up earlier is that a lot of our historic properties are also vacant. So figuring out, just if we restrict the requirements are fairly restrictive as it is, and to just narrow the pool even further, I am just wondering what that might do long-term to the committee. I think short-term, if we can make it happen and get good people in those positions, it would expedite really good work.
What if one of the owners of property is an and/or member at large, so that if someone applies that doesn't own property in the historic overlay district, but does own a historic property or, has a vested interest as a community member, it's like it could go either way and we're not overly limiting that seat.
That could work.
Yeah, I just think the property owners, to Jesse's point, to discussions we've all had, is that the property owners are the ones that really clearly can provide the most feedback into going through the process. What did it look like for them? What did it look like if we are CGL, or CLG, what does it look like to get the tax credits? What does that process look like? How do we make it streamlined and easier for people while still accomplishing our historic preservation goals? So I just think having folks who have that knowledge really brings a lot of benefit to the committee. I think to Jim's point, the dual piece, right? The folks that have the historic preservation knowledge and are coming through the Historic Society, the folks that have the building knowledge, and then the folks that have the property ownership going through the process knowledge.
So what sort of direction do we give here?
It sounds like we give quite a bit already. In the direction we've given so far, what could use further clarification from your perspective, Lucy?
I think that this is all good direction. I will talk to someone at the Historic Society. One thing I did forget to mention, and it's a smaller thing, was originally I made a recommendation to rename the Historic Review Committee to the Historic Preservation Commission. So it sounds like that's not required after hearing Lindsay speak. So I'm thinking I may take that out, but if you have any thoughts on that. And then if you are all okay with the kind of structure of adopting members from the Planning Commission and then recruiting new members.
I think it depends on, for the latter question, I think it depends on what the composition ends up, like the requirements end up being. I think if we present to, in the next draft, a member of the Board of Trustees, a member from the Planning Commission, a resident owner of property within the historic overlay district, a year-round resident and or resident owner of property within the historic overlay district, and a member from the San Juan County Historical Society. And then we get feedback from the San Juan County Historical Society on that kind of composition. If we ended up sticking with that, I like the idea that you suggested of like a 3 and 2 split of 3 2-year terms and 2 1-year terms, or vice versa. And it seems like it'd be pretty easy for all of the kind of the people who we already have captive to be either like of the either the 1 or 2-year terms, which would be a Board of Trustee member, a Planning Commission member, and a San Juan Historical Society member. Like it'd be easy for all 3 of those roles to be 2-year terms. And then for the 2 kind of new appointments, which would be owner of property, like resident owner of property, or citizen at large, those 2 could be the 1-year terms. Because that way we don't have to like bring citizens who haven't been involved totally up to speed quite as much.
Right.
I wonder too, if maybe for Lucy and Gloria, if we need to or can check with Clayton on how we can specify the residency requirement request that we're making, like to make it really clear for both of these property owners, we're talking about year-round residents.
And to ask them about the naming of it.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'm guessing we don't really have a strong opinion about the name. So we just go with whatever's required or the least confusing.
Right.
No, if we want to get people to sit on it, we might need to make it sound.
Happy, we need some marketing here.
I was going, yeah.
Yeah, give me some fun names. We can make it happen.
We got to come up with a really great acronym. We're gonna work on that.
Yeah, I like that. Send me an email.
Something with club.
Yeah.
It's gonna be the committee everybody wants to be on. They're gonna be lining up.
I had a quick question, which is in one of the I think it's in section 16.2.320. Where there's like the specific code proposed language, or maybe that's even existing. It says members shall be chosen only after adequate solicitation of applications published in the local newspaper. I was wondering if we should specify what adequate solicitation is. And that's more of a question for Clayton. But does that mean like advertisements for a month, of a certain size and bold, or is it, something different?
That's good. Nice catch.
Yeah, I will make a note of that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Because I mean, once we do get this figured out, this won't really exist until we solicit and then choose whatever the new members are.
Right.
So we still have a while.
Yeah.
And then I guess a question I have is, once we do figure out the composition and the process of appointment, is it this commission's responsibility to then figure out how to clarify the process and the rules, or whose responsibility is that to like help create the more objective standards and the clear process so that people going through the process have a better experience than what we're providing today?
Yeah, and can I piggyback on that too? Because thinking about if we go down the route of becoming a CLG, then is it this board that's getting training on revising and rewriting our code related to this? Or is it related to our planning department that then workshops it with this group? Or, again, just like, how does this look in the future?
Sure, so I'll take a stab at that. So this is kind of why I started with the reorganization of this board, so that we have a clear kind of line forward. And part of that is we need to, separate out this board. we need to look at our overlay districts, which is our AROD and our historic review overlay districts, and evaluate those. And in that evaluation, we include this new board, but we also, it's at a town trustee level as well. So we include them, but it's really the town trustees that are making these ultimate decisions on how we move forward with our codes. Does that help kind of clarify it again? And I lost track of my thoughts. So
Yeah, that's great.
Let me know.
That was super helpful. Yes.
And then kind of a related question, which I think I know the answer to based on that would be, would this board interact with this trust? Would the new historic preservation or review board, whatever we name it, interact with the trustees similar to how the planning commission currently does, where it's a recommendation committee as opposed to a decision-making committee, so that, you know, they would review applications and then they'd recommend conditional approval or denial of, and then we'd ultimately make the decision, or this board would ultimately make the decision, or would this be something that, you know, kind of stands alone?
Well, now the historic review board currently like stands alone in their decision, as far as like, they don't make recommendations to the trustees, they approve or deny. Unlike the planning commission that makes the recommendations. So does that help kind of clear that up?
So that definitely clears up how it happens today.
Right.
Is it required that it stands alone, or what would be the pros and cons of having it formed similar to the planning commission, so that it was a recommendation board as opposed to a decision board?
And we'd have to look into that. I don't know if Lucy has an answer right off. Go ahead, Lucy.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say the only thing that I can think of off the top of my head, and we can do more research, it takes more time to make a recommendation to the Board of Trustees and then wait. So that's the only thing that I would say at the moment.
Then approval and denial.
Yeah, correct.
Well, and it seems like when we heard from Lindsay regarding becoming a CLG, it talked about, you know, we can have an ordinance that is basically recommendations, right? That doesn't have a ton of teeth to it. I think our current ordinance is fairly prescriptive of what people can and can't do. And that's what our current ordinance is. So it seems like that's what the Historic Review Board has historically been given permission or authority to do. And so if we're thinking about a different ordinance or continuing our ordinances, it seems like it's kind of open question.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Like in the process of setting up this new board, we would need to consider the way the ordinance that would govern that work is written relative to its regulatory ability. She called it regulatory versus like an honorary program.
Right.
And that we haven't had. Is that something that we need to discuss tonight, or can that be put off to after the formation of that board?
I feel like we should, I think that should be all part of the same thing. Like, as we develop the structure of the board and the composition of the board and the requirements for the board, we also should think about how it interacts with this board. I think Lucy's point is really well taken, that it's more efficient for it to stand alone, but I also see some major benefits to the checks and balances that exist today between the planning commission and this board. And I think, for example, the experience we just had with Columbine Park. So, you know, fortunately we were the town and we were somewhat omniscient, and, or, you know, we were able to disregard some things with the planning commission and then fix it on the back end because we're the town. But imagine how frustrating that experience would have been if it ended at the planning commission level, if we were a regular applicant. And I feel like in some cases, we may be, like, this board may be able to consider things from a different perspective than the direction that this specific review board is given the direction. Because I think, like we talked about, the planning commission did their job in the town's review, but we were able to say, like, ooh, this is misaligned right here, let's fix that. And then we all, you know, got along at the end. But I imagine the same thing could happen here, where it'd be really helpful for the town and the review board to be able to work together to come out with the best possible outcome.
I think I've been diving deep into this. I think there is still an appeal process. Even when there was a historic review board that was making an approve or deny, I think there was still an appeal process to the Board of Trustees.
Yeah, you could approve
Right.
to the
Yeah.
board.
So I
With-
think that gives some
That's,
checks.
yeah, same with, it's the same as the Board of Adjustments and
Right.
It's a time issue then.
it's, if you don't like the way they roll,
Right.
then you can take it in front of the town trustees.
So maybe that splits the difference of like not having to come before the review board and come before the trustees. If the review board is a decision-making board, but the applicant still has the ability to appeal. Maybe
That's a great compromise.
And they appeal to the town.
to the town, to the Board of Trustees, yeah.
All subject to, Clayton and Lucy and Gloria reviewing that us making up these rules on the fly.
Well, and like for some of them, there's very strict, like the Board of Adjustments, you can only take it to the Board of Trustees based on hardship. Like it's very specific. Like if you can demonstrate hardship, then you can have it reviewed by the Board of Trustees. So I don't know if there's anything we could put in there just so everything isn't reviewed because we just didn't like it, but like it didn't meet, we don't feel like it met this criteria, whatever that is. And obviously when you get into historical buildings and things like that, it gets pretty vague, but yeah, I'm not sure if that's something that we could add in there, but I did like, as far as the Board of Adjustments goes, I think since it's so cut and dry, it makes it really easy in that way, because otherwise everything would be appealed to the town board.
Yeah, I mean, I take your point there, but I also acknowledge that Lisa Adair had said that hardship requirement was really bad.
Well, it's pretty vague, as far as I can tell, but.
But you're not recommending that we repeat that same
Oh, no,
requirement. You're just saying
No, just
the Board of Adjustments
just,
to make it
right,
clear.
like here's a few clear things that this is why you would be able to have it reviewed by the town board rather than just for any reason, just saying, oh, I just don't like the outcome, so I'm just going to review everything. Because if that's the way it does start to go, then we should just have it go in front of both anyway.
Well, it seems like
That's time consuming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
it seems like today the biggest issues that I hear about are the feeling of a decision being subjective or inconsistent. And so I wonder if there's a way to capture that in a reasonable, clear
As the
way.
reason for appeal.
Yeah,
Maybe Clayton can come up with something.
yeah.
That would be, I think that's important direction then at this time to discuss that relationship between the boards and the authority that the new board has.
And Lucy, can I ask one more question just for my mental clarification? Is there ever really an instance where someone would go through both the planning commission and the historic review board?
Yes.
A lot, yeah.
Yeah.
There are situations where that would happen. One example is if you were to build an accessory dwelling unit in the historic review district, then you would need to go through both. And there's
Mhm.
other reasons too. So that is another thing that we would have to kind of consider as well.
Yeah, like if we can keep approaching it from the lens of streamlining and
Well,
simplifying.
And actually, that's a really good point, and we're working on that because we're having, recently we had a project on Main Street come in to get historical review board approval. And they got it, but now they have to come back and get planning commission approval. And we're trying to figure out if they come with all the proper material the first time, if we can just say, you meet the historical overlay criteria and you've met all of your planning commission criteria, and we can sign off on both of them.
Mhm.
So that the historic review board can be the keeper of the more restrictive, specific requirements for historic buildings. And that if you've gone through that rigor, by the time you come to the planning commission, they're reviewing it and stamping it.
Yeah, it should be hopefully by that time, because you have to give a list of materials if you're doing historic stuff. You have to give, plans. Everything has to be, everything that you would need for the planning commission already has to be there for
Right.
historic review board. So it should almost be a rubber stamp by the planning commission if a approved by the Historic Review Board, but for some reason it's not at this point.
Mhm.
I can imagine that
Hmm.
process still being potentially flawed. So I think that potentially. So I think our direction back to Lucy and Gloria would be that it sounds like there's a handful of options, and Clayton. We could have this committee stand alone. They could be a recommendation committee to the planning commission, which then recommends to us. They could be a recommendation directly to us, or they could be a decision-making committee that we have a veto to, or like the interaction between us and the planning commission is also somewhat up in the air. So I think it would be a question back to you to use the planning department's kind of like many experiences with this process in the past, to recommend what you think would provide the most streamlined, balanced, and efficient process for citizens and us. And it's a lot.
Again, with the lens of making things easier instead of harder and less expensive instead of more. And yeah.
Well, and
And
I
predict.
know that the county, the Board of County Commissioners will take, so the Planning Commission, you have to take your plan to them. Is it 2 or 3 times before the county will look at it and decide to approve it? But the Planning Commission can give the recommendation that they don't need to do any of the further Planning Commission meetings and that everything is complete. And then the county commissioners rely on that and say, okay, we've approved this project based on the Planning Commission saying that they have everything that they need and they don't need to do a second reading or a second review. So maybe we could have something like that in there, but and then you really rely on the thoroughness of that body.
I think Jim had his hand up.
Yeah, Jim.
I was just raising my hand as an example of someone who has gone through both processes.
Rock and roll.
So can we vote you on as one of those property owners? Wearing many hats.
I don't know.
Then Jim could serve for one
Trustee.
person for 3
Three
positions.
seats, yeah. Well,
There you go.
Jeff or Jordan, do you all have any insights?
I definitely support the separating of the 2 boards. I keep going back to trustee priority number 5A, which is clarifying the roles and communicating the processes. So I think that that's something that is the direction. So let's clarify the roles, communicate processes with the input of the current board, and then streamline. Like everyone said, can streamline the process for the citizens. So no, definitely on board with creating the 2 different groups. I just think that like really clear roles would be helpful as it becomes 2 different boards.
Yeah, and I don't have a whole lot of new insight to add. I think more or less just waiting to hear back from Lucy and Clayton to see what's feasible and what processes are kind of what are our options before we move forward.
I think it would be really helpful as we're reviewing. So I imagine the process, there's some updating to the memo and the proposed draft ordinance based on this conversation, then feedback from the San Juan County Historical Society and Clayton, and then thinking through some recommendations about what the scope of the board is and how the process works relative to the Planning Commission and this board. And then I think something that would be super helpful when we consider this potentially at a formal trustee meeting as opposed to a work session would be like an example application. So we could see what that process and timeline looks like. And maybe that would help us also troubleshoot any sticky spots or inefficiencies in the process.
So you would like to see more on the process of going through the historic review board?
It would be like a case study, like a mock, or I don't,
Yeah,
correct me if I'm wrong,
Exactly.
but I'm just picturing like something that's not actually coming before any boards. It's a made up case of something that has some typical characteristics of applications that would potentially go through the planning process that we could use as just a visual of like, okay, so now if this is our structure that we have in place for the board, and this is the way it relates to the other boards, and these are the members, and this process is approved by all of the people involved, including the lawyer. Now let's take it for a test drive.
totally. So I
Yeah,
think it has the dual purpose of, it has the dual purpose of helping explain the process to everybody else really easily. And also not having an actual applicant be our like troubleshooting guinea pig.
Yeah.
But allowing us to try and like find any issues in the process ahead of time.
okay. That sounds good. Originally, when I wrote this memo, I was not thinking of changing the process too much. But it sounds like you guys would like to see changes to the process included in the memo.
Well, I would say right now, none of us have great clarity on the process. And I think that that also applies to most of the citizens. And so even if the recommendation is the process as you and Gloria currently understand it, putting that process in some type of like memo form so that we all are on the same page would be super helpful.
Okay.
And I think it'll be really important to establishing the integrity of that board. So as we're going through establishing the board, that the process is really transparent for everyone in the community, and then also for people who are going to apply, so that they're like, the board has validity and people in the community understand how the board is there and why it's there and who's on it and what they're doing. I think that will be important for that board's function in its role.
I just want to recognize that these processes are still being formed too, because we are looking at the AROD and the historic overlay. So we can do kind of a mock thing on how it would work today. And then give some like, ideally, this would be the situation, but I just want to give your expectations kind of a check there, because we are still operating, we would be operating on like how it would work today, even though we anticipate changing those processes as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that that's one of my biggest goals, and the project that I'm feeling the most passionate about is making these processes a lot easier for citizens. And then I just see the separation as a step in that direction rather than a complete new process. Just to further go off of Gloria's point.
So not to belabor this point, but I do think that we are to make the distinction between all the processes here. There's the process in separating the boards and establishing the new one. And that's one thing that we need to make transparent and clear to our community. And there's the other process, which is the process of applying and going through all of the different boards on your own project. And I think both are really important to be clear about and streamline. And, it's just that the one in establishing the board, once it's done, it's done. We just need to make sure we're doing it right from the get-go. And communicating about that well, I think, is my point.
Absolutely. Yeah, that sounds great.
Well, this is exciting.
This is a huge conversation for this town, and there's one public
It's a
person
really
here.
big deal. That's what I mean about
Conversation,
communicating.
and there's
Yeah.
nobody here. Kind of funny.
Is there any other clarification that would be helpful from the trustees in terms of what next steps be, or other questions you have that we could try and answer or provide direction for now? Lucy or Gloria?
Oh, sorry, I thought you were talking to the trustees. No, I think that this is awesome feedback, and I'm super excited to talk to Clayton and the Historic Society and work on this more and get it more refined. So I thank you all so much for all the feedback.
Yeah, I would say this is a really good conversation, and thank you all for your attention tonight.
Awesome.
Great.
I guess just kicking it back to citizen perspective real quick. Any other
I have like
Back work.
so many thoughts on the process itself and like how the process could be improved and streamlined and made more efficient, but that's not the topic for tonight. But I do think that I know you all are unclear as to whether to provide the staff with direction to explore changing the process. And as a citizen, I would request that you provide that direction as well as just an understanding of the current process, because if you want this committee to have integrity, but you're going to hand them a broken process to work with, you know, it's already a big job and it's a thankless job, I'm sure, for the people on the committee. So I would love to see them set up for success.
cool?
Great.
Yeah, it sounds like we all support understanding the current process better and also reevaluating the process with the formation of the new committee.
And
Is that
perhaps I'm
fair?
unclear, but my understanding is that this new board would potentially, part of what their job is as they are established is to work with CLG and the resources that are provided through that organization to improve our processes. They don't necessarily have to inherit a broken system and just take it, right? Will that board be able to amend and no?
Like, I mean, they'll be learning, it sounds like, that they would be making recommendations to this board because this board remains responsible for the code provisions.
So then
Or Gloria,
where does
has
that
there-
happen? Yeah.
And while I would like to give them like a full completed package of you know, this is where we go from here. Kind of the timeline I see happening is as we go through our code revisions, this committee is being formed. So it is going to be a little bit more, I don't know how to say this, but like kind of a road, like, well, that didn't work, let's do this. It's going to be evolving for a couple of years is what I'm trying to get out is if we could package everything up and just hand it to them, that would be great, but that's not how it's probably going to work. It's going to be more of an evolution, and that's really kind of the best case scenario, because we don't want to say like, this is it, stick to this, we figured it all out, when they find little idiosyncrasies within what we've done. So I see it as a collaboration coming in. Yes, we do want to give them clear direction on what they are doing as far as making determinations or you know what their processes are, but I see all that evolving over the years, if that helps.
Well, and so my husband always says we all have to be able to walk and chew at the same time, right? We're all doing that all the time. And so I think remembering that we have like the master plan as a piece, we have the code rewrite as a piece, we have rethinking our planning department as a piece, we have establishing these new boards as a piece, becoming a CLG. Like these are all things that are happening at the same time. We're building the plane as we're flying it, and we can't lose sight of how these are connected too. And it's not like one happens and then we get the code all rewritten and then we establish that they're all kind of happening simultaneously. But hopefully the goal is that all of these things that are happening are connected. They're not disconnected. So our master plan is connected to what we're doing in the code rewrite and what we're doing in these new boards that are being discussed and talked about and what we might do for new ordinances. It's all connected, hopefully.
Yes, Dana, that is the goal, and that's kind of why we're talking about this all at once.
Thank you.
I think there's also like a component, like a softer component of like the mission of this new committee or board or group. And I think right now the process acts more like a gatekeeper
Mm.
to prevent undesirable developments in Silverton that are not viewed as historic by the guidelines that are loosely provided in our handbook and the perspectives of the members. But I think the other piece of this that I'm hearing a lot of me saying, but also you all saying, is that it's almost like a citizen, like advocacy, like guide group, that it's like this, like we're here to facilitate this process for you, not just to keep you from doing something that doesn't have, gingerbread stuff on it.
Well, and if we go down the CLG route, then it's this avenue to access potential tax credits and to provide some potential support or get state historic preservation experts to help. So yeah, like framing it in this framework that it's more of a resource as well, as opposed to a gatekeeper.
Simultaneously both, hopefully, yeah.
Yes. I don't know if you guys all saw with the Silverton Standard a couple of weeks ago that in the caboose, it talked about a gas station sold and the proposed new development was going to be a Kentucky Fried Chicken back in the 1970s. So we could, I mean, we just should end on that.
The circle thing. I was like, we've been missing out on chicken sandwiches.
Okay, I mean, that's awesome. Any other closing thoughts, questions, remarks? Cool. Well, this was a really good step forward. Lucy, the memo is really clear and incredibly helpful. So thank you. And yeah, this is great. I'm looking forward to the next steps. So the time is 6:36 p.m. and this meeting is now adjourned. I hope you all have a wonderful
Thank
evening.
you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Gloria, are you sick? I'm sorry. I hope you feel better soon.
You've got the great Lisa from Friends voice.
I saw the
Yeah.
sign. Did you guys see the sign that somebody put on our door?
No.
The biohazard.
Yeah, it says do not enter without biohazard suit or PAPR. Wait, what?
Yeah, well.
Gloria, let us know if there's anything we can do.